Hello, I'm Keith Campbell, independent priest of the Home Temple, and welcome to God Smarts. Now, we've spent a few episodes talking about the Bible, but where did we get the Bible? Who wrote it exactly? Well, according to tradition and to Hollywood, the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses himself. Here's how Hollywood sees it.
Merritt, give me the books. Eleazar, set these 5 books in the Ark of the Covenant by the tablets of the 10 Commandments, which the Lord restored unto us.
Well, as inspiring as that idea is, careful readers through the years have noticed a few problems with it. And the first one comes right after the scene we just watched, because right after saying goodbye to Joshua, Moses goes up on the mountain to die. And yet somehow manages to sneak an account of his own death into the books he just handed to Eleazar. Let's look at it. All right, so this is from the book of Deuteronomy, which is one of the 5 books that Moses supposedly wrote. And here it says, "So Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of Yahweh. He buried him in the valley in the land of Moab over against Beth Peor, but no man knows of his tomb to this day." Couple weird things here. First of all, this is written in the 3rd person and the past tense, as something that's already happened, which is kind of a strange way to write about your own death. Secondly, notice this phrase, "no man knows of his tomb to this day." Now, this is the phrase that would be used by somebody writing about an event that's happened way back in the past. So, did God really have Moses write about his own death as if it had happened a long time ago, years and years before it really happened? Or does it make more sense that somebody else wrote about Moses' death a long time after it happened? This next one's even more embarrassing if it was written by Moses, because we're told Moses was a very humble man.
Who am I, Lord, that you should send me? How can I lead this people out of bondage? What words can I speak that they will heed?
We read in one of the books of Moses, "Now the man Moses was very humble, above all the men who were on the surface of the earth." Does the humblest man on earth really praise his own humility? It makes much more sense that it was written by somebody who lived after Moses and admired him. Now let's look at a few anachronisms in the first 5 books of Moses, when they refer to people, places, or events from the perspective of someone who lived long after the time of Moses. Now here's one example. We're told in Genesis that to rescue his nephew Lot, Abraham chases the Mesopotamian kings all the way to a place called Dan. Except that it wasn't called Dan. It was called Laish. It wasn't renamed Dan until long after the time of Moses. Here's another example. It says in Genesis that Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. The Canaanite was then in the land. But the Canaanite was still in the land when Moses died. So when this author says, oh, back then the Canaanite was still in the land, this is written by somebody who's never seen a Canaanite, long after the time of Moses. Now this next one's a little tricky. It involves some geography, so let's pay attention. It says, "They took his land in possession, and the land of Og, king of Bashan, the 2 kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan toward the sunrise." Now, this is from the book of Deuteronomy, from a speech Moses is giving to Israel on the plains of Moab just before he goes up to Mount Nebo to get a faraway glimpse of the promised land and then to die. So he's about here. Now, this is before the Israelites crossed over the Jordan River into Canaan. But he describes defeating the kings of the Amorites who lived here. But he says that they were beyond the Jordan River toward the sunrise. But that would only make sense to someone who lived here in the land of Israel. If someone living in Israel had crossed the Jordan River toward the sunrise in the east, he would have been in the land of the ancient Amorite. So it makes much more sense that this would have been written by somebody living in Israel after the crossing of the Jordan than by Moses before. If Moses had made these geographical references to the children of Israel on the plains of Moab, they would have been scratching their heads. It wouldn't have made any sense, because to them, the Amorites were to the north, not across the Jordan toward the sunrise. That would have made no sense at all. Now here's one more. The book of Genesis talks about the kings in the land of Edom, and then helpfully says this: these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the children of Israel. But there weren't any kings in Israel until more than 400 years after the time of Moses. So whoever wrote this is looking back in time, not only at Moses, but at David and Solomon and perhaps some of the other kings. So there are a lot more like this, but I think you get the idea. How do we explain this? Well, perhaps God, in his omniscience, had Moses write and say things that would be better understood by people living at a later date in Israel. The problem with that idea is that it means that the people actually listening to Moses or reading his words while he was alive would have been completely confused by some of the things he was saying. Another possibility is that after the fact, one or more scribes went through the books and put in more up-to-date references. Now, if we were only dealing with these handful of verses, this might be a good explanation. But beginning in the 17th century, careful readers were noticing other signs that the books of Moses had been written by several completely different authors with their own different points of view. In fact, there are several places where the Old Testament refers the reader to other books, other source material that they were using. Books like the Book of Jasher, the Book of the Acts of Solomon, the Book of Nathan the Prophet, the Book of the Wars of the Lord, books that we don't have anymore. That we'd love to have these books. Who knows what they contain? Who knows what things have been left out of the Old Testament?
The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 10 commandments for all to obey.
All joking aside, we will get into some of the evidence for these different sources in our next episode. But let's remember that just because God didn't dictate to Moses the first 5 books of the Bible verbatim doesn't mean that they don't contain ancient sources and inspired writings. What it does mean is that we need a little detective work to uncover some of these fascinating layers that we find in the Old Testament and gain new insights into the Bible through them. And we'll pursue this quest further through some of the next few episodes. Until then, this is Keith Campbell for God Smarts, and thank you for listening.